I am an extremist. And so are you. In fact, most sane people are extremists. And those who are not should probably ask themselves, why not? Is extremism really that bad? What about utopianism? Are they both the same thing? Let's explore. Hello everyone, and welcome to a new installment of Freedom Alternative Research and Analysis. Now, around 2.5 years ago, something like that, I defined myself for the first time in public as an extremist. And I wasn't joking, I really am an extremist. For instance, I believe that the state should amount to no more than 15% of the national income, preferably somewhere between 7 and 10%. I believe the European Union is a fundamental danger for all the peoples of Europe and should thus be dismantled. In fact, I believe the EU is so dangerous that any act that undermines the EU bureaucracy in any way, shape or form should seriously be considered. Now, notice that I say the EU bureaucracy because unlike the Euro fanatics, who are the non-extremists of this day, I do make the difference between European cooperation and the supranational federal dictatorship that the EU actually is. I like European cooperation through capitalism, but I don't like medieval customs unions. I know I'm being an extremist, but I already admitted that, so that's fine. I also believe that 100% of the laws that purport to limit the free expression of ideas on the basis of feelings, any feelings, be them racism, insults, or bigotry, or whatnot, all of these laws are fundamentally wrong, and I believe that disobeying these laws is a moral duty for all mentally sane people. I also believe that cultures are not equal. For instance, I hold the deeply extremist belief that the Islamic culture is fundamentally inferior to any culture of any country in Europe. I think that Belarus, arguably the most messed up country in Europe at this point, is still far superior, actually light years ahead, to any expression of Islamic culture. And I don't mean the nation's governments, although even there Saudi Arabia is obviously inferior to Belarus, but I mean the culture. Belarusian culture is inherently better than Islamic culture. I believe men and women are and should be equal in the eyes of the law, but I fundamentally reject the notion that men and women are or can ever be equal in any other area. As an individualist, in itself an extremist position nowadays, I believe people are different, not equal. You know, when I was in high school, the first class in logic started with the lesson that A is not equal with B unless B is defined as just another notation for A. I still abide by that lesson. As a result, I'm not an egalitarian and I do not treat all the people the same way. This is just a sample of the beliefs that I hold, beliefs that today are controversial at the very least, if not downright extremist. Now, let me give you a list of extremist beliefs in the past. For instance, the First Amendment of the United States Constitution was in and of itself an extremist position when it was written. The belief that there is such thing as unalienable rights was also an extremist position. The belief that Stalin may be wrong on certain issues was an extremist belief for a few decades, and holding that belief was very, very dangerous. The belief that the earth is moving was for many centuries an extremist belief. The belief that the Pope is not untouchable and beyond criticism. The belief that the Bible can be interpreted and even rejected by non-clergy. The belief that the evolution is real. The belief that mental illness is real and curable by science and not caused by demons to be cured through exorcism. The belief that the Soviet Union was evil. The belief that state-enforced equality of outcome is harmful. The belief that hitting your children is not exactly the most sound practice of child rearing. All of these beliefs and many, many others have been at one time regarded as fundamentally extremist and worthy of mockery and exclusion from polite society. Many people actually lost their lives for holding these extremist beliefs. Yet somehow, with all this history behind us, the label extremist still holds a negative connotation today, even though time and time again throughout history, the extremists were the ones who eventually had their way. Now, mind you, I'm not saying that all extremist ideas are sound. There are also a lot of extremist ideas who have won in the arena and whose negative effects we are experiencing now or have experienced in the past. For instance, the extremist idea that the family doesn't matter and can thus be meddled with is an extremist idea that now wreaks havoc in Europe and North America. The idea that the traditional family is inherently patriarchally oppressive is an extremist idea that has been embraced by far too many people and with dire consequences. The idea that all cultures are equal is another extremist idea that is now wreaking havoc in various European cities. What I am saying, though, is that a significant portion, perhaps even a majority of ideas deemed extremist in their time, do indeed turn out to be very sound when examined closely. But whilst I am an extremist, and I have no qualms in admitting so, I am not a utopian. My ideal society isn't actually that ideal. And that's what makes, to me, the difference between an extremist with whom a conversation is worth having and an extremist with whom a conversation isn't really worth having. My ideal society is just better than the current one, but by any means still imperfect. Any extremist worth his salt needs to first and foremost understand that there is no such thing as perfect. Perfect only exists in human imagination and abstract concepts. In reality, there is only good enough. Just like in the past, the public discourse today examines new ideas only in terms of extremists and non-extremists, and that's always a problem because the term extremist can only exist in reference to the status quo. For instance, everything about the United States was extremist in reference to the status quo at the formation of that country. When in 1987 a few thousands of people decided to go out in the streets to sing and fly the flag of a country that did not exist officially and say no, that was an extremist position. That country was Estonia, then part of the Soviet Empire, which obliterated them from the map and was still trying really, really hard to obliterate their culture, their language, and their national identity. In reference to the status quo, those were the extremists. But they weren't utopians, you see. They didn't believe that all problems will magically be resolved once Estonia will be restored on the map. The founders of the United States also did not believe that all problems will magically go away once the new nation is founded. And that's what makes the difference between extremists who are worth considering and extremists whom one is safe to dismiss. This awareness that the world is imperfect and will remain imperfect because human nature is fundamentally flawed. If an extremist is not aware of this, then that's a dangerous person because that lack of awareness usually ends in concentration camps and generalized misery if that individual gets his way. Our moral superiors on the far left and our nuisances on the so-called far right routinely display a lack of awareness of the fact that the world is imperfect and display a common disdain for some freedoms. Now, I say the so-called far right because what the mainstream regards as far right isn't really that right. I am on the far right. What the mainstream sees as far right is, as you can see on the graph, quite far away from me and a lot closer to the far left than many would be willing to admit. But anyway, that's a separate discussion which I'll leave for another time, so for the sake of convenience, I will use the term far right in the sense that the mainstream uses it. This far right purports to get us rid of degeneracy, impure cultural elements and sometimes racial elements, economic activities that support degeneracy and or impure cultural elements. They also purport to bring more unity through a more monolithic or less diverse society, and as the argument goes, once that is achieved, the society will be better off and quite utopian thanks to the harmony that is being created. Now, I think that's a fair representation of what the mainstream views as far right. Now, whether that sounds appealing to one or not, the problems emerge in the implementations of these solutions to reach those goals. To reach that level of harmony, one must physically get rid of the people who don't fit the profile, and that can be done by executions or mass deportations. Both of these pose some serious moral and logistic issues. More to the point, even if it is achieved, it still needs force to maintain, because, you see, nature abhors entropy, as I explained in the second half of this video. The modern far left, on the other hand, purports to get us rid of poverty, racism, sexism, religion, and distinctions of sex. They also purport to bring us perfect equality and, without any sense of irony, to make us all united in diversity. Now, as with the far right, the problems emerge in the implementation of the solutions needed to reach those goals. And the solutions include importing as much diversity as possible without any regard for the consequences, racist and sexist policies of affirmative action, and indoctrination of the youth that their dicks and vaginas are social constructs. Just like with the far right, once some of the utopia is being achieved, force is being employed in order to maintain it. Now, Stalin had the gulags. The modern far left has political correctness, although legislation is on the pipeline to build re-education camps for those who dare to deviate from the official dogma. What these two have in common, besides the utter disdain for freedom, is the lack of awareness about the flaws of human nature. In other words, they are utopians. And that is what makes them dangerous. Not the fact that they're extremists. Their extremist point of view can and could be allowed to exist under freedom, provided that no force is being used. And by that, I mean that freedom of association does indeed apply to utopian extremists as well. Personally, I would have no qualms if a bunch of fascists were gathering on their own property to form a white-only community, or a black-only for that matter, since black nationalism is really no different. As long as members are allowed to leave whenever they please, who am I to force them to stay out of such communities and dictate how they should live? By the same token, if a bunch of leftists want to gather on their own property and form an egalitarian commune where all income is divided equally and all positions perfectly reflect the demographics of the community, regardless of achievements and individual differences, who am I to force them to shut down their community? As long as members aren't being kept in by force and they don't try to force others to join, that's their business. The sweet irony in these examples is that under freedom, and only under freedom, both kinds of utopians actually do have a chance of attempting to fulfill their dreams. Now, mind you, reality tells us that the dream is doomed to fail, but would be, nonetheless, free to try to prove reality wrong. The beauty of freedom is that it allows all minorities to express themselves peacefully, regardless of how those minorities are being defined. The other sweet irony is that although I am an extremist by mainstream sensibilities and I have no qualms in identifying as such, what I'm doing here is actually an appeal to moderation. The freedom alternative to utopianism is not only moderate because it takes into account the flaws of human nature, but it's also moderate in the sense that it leaves room for utopian extremists to express themselves without doing any harm to other people but themselves. And that makes me an extremist. Now, I said at the beginning of this video that most sane people are extremists, and those who are not should probably ask themselves, why not? Of course, I used extremists in the intro with the mainstream sense, or in reference to the status quo, if you like. Although the statement may seem far-fetched or even edgy on the surface, think about it a little bit. Are all your ideas really acceptable in polite conversation? Isn't there any position of yours that is completely outside of the Overton window and thus extremist? This is a serious question for everyone watching, but particularly for the leftists who watch this channel. Also, let's not forget that there is a second Overton window, the one of your peers. What may be unacceptable in polite society may still be acceptable amongst your peers. But still, do you always see eye to eye with your peers? Do you really have no position that is completely outside of the Overton window, even of your peer group? I know I do have such positions. For instance, most of my peers are either indifferent or mildly in favor of gay marriage, whilst I consider that gay marriage is a huge step in the wrong direction. I would rather see marriage being decoupled entirely from the government rather than see gay marriage legalized. And if decoupling it from the government is not an available option, then I would rather keep the status quo, which I regard it as the lesser evil for the simple reason that at least some people are naturally spared of having the government in their bedrooms in a disgusting ménage à trois. At this moment, some of you may say, but Lucian, you're making it impossible not to be an extremist. And that's indeed true. Once you take the logic of the label extremist to its logical conclusion, it really is impossible not to be an extremist. Not as long as you're mentally sane, anyway. As long as you're capable of forming thoughts and think about things, no matter how rudimentary and limited, you are bound to be at least a little bit extremist. And this rationale holds true regardless of education, race, sex, religion, you name it. If one pushes hard enough, one is bound to find extremists, both in oneself and in other people. And this is what you should do too. If you think of yourself as not an extremist, start thinking really hard at your positions on various topics and compare them with the so-called consensus of the mainstream. And then come back and say again that you're not an extremist. Now, I contend that if one can assert that one is not an extremist even after deep thought, that can only be if that person is not mentally sane, or more likely, because that person did not think things through enough. The point I'm trying to reach with this talk is the same point I made in fewer words at the end of the video regarding the subversion of language. Namely, that the desire to fit in and avoid being an extremist is not a virtue. The world is changed according to the desires of people who at one point were considered extremists. This has always been true in history, and it is true today and will be true in perpetuity. Name me a person who has changed something in the world and was not viewed as an extremist. Now, I dare you on that, because I'm not saying that such person doesn't exist, but I suspect it doesn't exist. And even if such person or persons do exist in history, the total number of them is likely minuscule, and the changes wielded by them are also minuscule. So yes, what I'm doing now is urging people to be extremists. It's not something inherently bad in being an extremist. It's inherently bad to be a utopian, because utopian thinking is bound to bring harm to others and yourself. So, to sum up, because I've been going on for quite some time now, is extremism really that bad? Nope, it isn't. Extremism in and of itself is like having long hands. It's an amoral feature of one person. What makes a difference is the goals of and the expression of that extremism. If one uses his long hands in order to get rich through stealing, that's immoral. The same holds true with extremism. If one's extremism is about pushing a utopian worldview through force and coercion, that's when it's bad and immoral. Extremism, as seen by the mainstream, is not inherently bad, nor it is inherently good. Utopianism, however, is inherently bad because it doesn't work, but even utopianism should be allowed to exist and express itself in ways that don't harm others. The distinctions between extremism in general and utopianism in particular is something that I would hope you remain with from this video and pass the idea on to others. Because for now, way too many people are under the impression that just because the mainstream declared an idea to be extreme, that suddenly means it is bad, unachievable, and thus utopian or harmful. When in reality, things aren't usually this way, and the extreme label is usually temporary anyway. Isn't it nice? I started with the admission of being an extremist and ended with an appeal to tolerance and moderation. And this thought process is in and of itself extreme. Anyway, thanks a lot for watching, and please tell me in the comments if I've been too abstract. I'm still trying to find this sweet spot between educational content and entertainment and advocacy for unpopular positions, so please bear with me. Alright then I'll see you around at Freedom Alternative.